Those of us who watched a lot of news in the 80s and 90s will recognize Elizabeth as the foreign correspondent and principal substitute anchor for the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. She has reported in print and on film from countries all over the world, including Chile, Cambodia, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, Botswana, and Turkey, and others. She is also an award-winning filmmaker. In addition to her novel Last Flight, which we will be discussing today, she has also written a highly praised memoir, A Train Through Time. To our panel today, especially our guests Ted Wheeler and Elizabeth Farnsworth. This is the panel entitled There Are No Non-Combatants. My name is Sonia Zaki. I teach history and politics at Bishop Seabury Academy in Lawrence, and I published some of my own historical research in the Chronicles of Oklahoma and Kansas history. But I'm not a fiction writer. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Humanities Kansas for sponsoring the Kansas Book Festival. What an extraordinary celebration of works and writers we have here today. And now I'll introduce our guests. Ted Wheeler is a writer, bookseller, and college professor from Omaha, Nebraska. He is the author of the novels In Our Other Lives and Kings of Broken Things, and the collection of short fiction, Bad Faith. The War Begins in Paris, which we will be discussing today, was named a national bestseller by USA Today. He has been honored with a National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, a Nebraska Book Award, the Marion Russo Award from Key West Literary Seminar, and a fellowship from Akademie Schloss Solitude. For 7 years, he and his family ran Dundee Book Company, a neighborhood bookshop, and he currently is an assistant professor in the English department at Creighton University. Elizabeth Farnsworth's Kansas roots go back to pioneer days. She grew up in Topeka before earning degrees at Middlebury and Stanford. Elizabeth is well known for her illustrious career in journalism. She's written for the San Francisco Chronicle, Foreign Policy, Mother Jones, The Nation, and other news publications. Those of us who watched a lot of news in the 80s and 90s will recognize Elizabeth as the foreign correspondent and principal substitute anchor for the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. She has reported in print and on film from countries all over the world, including Chile, Cambodia, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, Botswana, and Turkey, and others. She is also an award-winning filmmaker. In addition to her novel Last Flight, which we will be discussing today, she has also written a highly praised memoir, A Train Through Time. So, Elizabeth and Ted, thanks for being here today. So maybe before we begin, Elizabeth, I'll start with you. Can you tell us just a little bit about your novel Last Flight and kind of a brief synopsis or overview of what it's about?
I can. I just want to say there are all kinds of friends in the audience, and a brother of one of my oldest best friend, and other people that I just want to say thank you for coming. And I do want to say that I wouldn't have this book if it weren't for Theodore Rademacher, my publisher. Raise your hand, please. And Greg German behind her has been helping me a lot with various computer and Wikipedia issues. So Greg, thank you a lot too. And anybody else here that I haven't named who helped me, thank you very, very much. You kind of want a synopsis. Can I start with how it came about?
We can. And you have written about or told about this in your interview, I think in PBR, that
you
saw
had this
vision.
strange vision. And this is the way my memoir came about this way too. I was working at my computer and I look at a library. My desk, a library is right there, and there were books. And all of a sudden, in front of me, a young woman with a ponytail and a cowboy hat on, and she's on a horse, came to me. And this image of her, and she's on the horse and looking through a barbed wire fence, and she's looking at a man who's in a one-story building, staring back at her, bandages all over his head, and he's staring back at her, and they look through he's looking through barred windows in this one-story building, and she's looking through this barbed wire fence at him. And I had been wanting, I was working, doing journalism at that moment, and I'd been wanting to write a novel. I wrote novels as a kid. I sent many stories to 17 magazine when I was 15 or 16, trying to get them published, and they weren't. And I thought, could these be my characters? And I could tell it was the Prairie. I could tell it was, I didn't know it was World War II, but he was wounded. So I thought, World War II. So I went to the Kansas Historical Society. I knew there were prisoners of war in Kansas. Was he a prisoner of war? And I knew it because any of you that were married at the beautiful little church on the Lawrence campus was built by German stonemason POWs would know that there were POWs all over Kansas. Many, many camps, many sub-camps. And so I did a lot of research, and I learned about those POWs that first came in 43. Those that were injured or ill were treated at the U.S. Army Hospital. And I created a story around that. And my story is a World War II story about a young woman who happened to have studied for a year in Vienna. Her father was, as my grandfather did, was studying medicine at the University of Vienna. And so the book is very much about Kansas, very much about and influenced by my own family life. And she becomes an interpreter for prisoners of war at the Army Hospital, which I invent and place near the Flint Hills. It's not Winter General. And that's the story. She becomes close is the wrong word. She has to interpret very much for a very ill prisoner of war who has amnesia, who doesn't really know who he is, or does he? Is he pretending to be somebody else? And in this situation, and I'll tell you one more thing that happened, and you'll get a picture of a setting for the drama of this book. In the camps, not the hospitals, but in the camps, POWs were instructed by their leaders, and especially these would have been very, very heavily Nazi POWs, that it would be okay to kill a stool pigeon. And so in the hospitals, I do not believe this happened, but I do invent a very serious problem in this hospital. And it's a pretty bloody story. So that's the story. I hope that we'll get into other aspects of it, but that's enough.
Well, and I can say I read this novel in one sitting on vacation with my daughter. I literally
Heck is short.
Still. And so, thank you, Elizabeth. It really is gripping. But I want to go back to how you think about that moment of inspiration, that vision. Have you thought about where it came from? Because I have my own interpretation of what that might come from, but I want to hear what you think about why you thought about that.
Well, now we get into imagination. Ted and I have had a few little emails about this, and Sonia and I too. Imagination is so magical and so unusual. I had imaginary playmates. How many people here had imaginary playmates? Brackatoonie and Tanny Junior were mine. And every time my cousins were, they still tease me about it. Where's Rackatoonie today? They'll say to me, even now. But so, I think that if you have this kind of imagination, and who knows why we all develop these imaginations. I lost a mother very young. Did I have to imagine things to really compensate for that? I don't know. But it's not that I see things, but things come into my mind like they're very real. And I can build an entire story out of it. And that's what happened with that. I just think it's something that I was born with. I really do. I don't know, what about you?
Yeah, it is interesting how you think about that. Because so much of my brain, I think, is kind of occupied thinking about stories, often that are not things that are real at all or fictional. So it does just kind of feel like something you're born with, or I don't know, just part of your personality. I was the second son and third child in my family, so I think maybe it comes from that, where I just got a lot more space to do what I wanted to. Like, people weren't kind of imposing on me all the time, where my parents were a lot more laissez-faire with me. So So like maybe in some ways I was allowed to have more imagination and to just play more in my head just because I didn't have the responsibilities of being the oldest or something like that.
This is so weird. We have so much in common, he and I. And you wouldn't think so. You're much younger than I am. But same here. Part of what I like to talk about with the book is I'm from a Kansas abolitionist family. My great-great-grandfather, I guess it would have been, came and was part of the Kansas battle against the Missourians coming over, and then later in the militia during the war, it was part of that too. And I think that this background that we have, if you have it, my parents wanted me to be hardy. They really admired their hardy ancestors, really admired what they had to do. I mean, what they had to do, my father's side, they were blizzarded out of South Dakota, the Dakotas, and had to come to work in the Santa Fe. They were destroyed by that blizzard. The children's blizzard in '88, called the children's blizzard because so many kids died. They wanted us to be hardy, so I had a huge amount of freedom as a child. My cousin Diane Reman and I had hideouts. We built fires and hideouts that were on the prairie. And I didn't know it was prairie. I just thought it was Shunganunga and all the area where we would go and wander, and around the hills just west of Topeka. But I think that's true. I think that's why maybe why we were very imaginative. All that freedom, the freedom that my husband and I gave our children too, and my grandchildren, thank heavens, have gotten it, but very few kids do these days.
I'd like to come back to that in a little bit, but before we do, Ted, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about The War Begins in Paris. You've written that this is a novel based on, as you put it, the misadventures of a real journalist turned Nazi mouthpiece. And I was going to Google a lot, as I also was binge reading your novel. It was also very suspenseful, hard to put down. So can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to tell the story of this very real person as a work of historical fiction and suspense?
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming first off, everyone. But so The War Begins in Paris is set in 1938, or starts in 1938, and follows a group of American foreign correspondents. So for one, it's a real thrill to be up here with Elizabeth, since you have lived that life that I've imagined for a long time when I was writing this book. So there are a number of real characters, so like William Scheider, Edward Murrow, Martha Gellhorn, all kind of make cameos in the book. But the main character is named Jane Anderson, who is also a real character. When she was younger, she was also a war reporter in her early 20s in the First World War. And was kind of known for these adventure reporter things she would do, like she reported from trenches. She was the first woman to ride in an airplane over London. She was the first journalist to go into a submarine and actually go underwater. So she had this history that was really compelling. This kind of Atlanta debutante, but she also was raised in the Arizona territories, who became a war reporter, which was really fascinating. It was like, why have I never heard of this reporter before? But the main reason is that she also was a fascist and radio worked for Goebbels during World War II. So rightly, she's kind of been erased for those reasons. So I first read about Jane in 2014 when I was at Academy Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart, Germany on a fellowship. I was just kind of interested in what Americans were doing around World War II era and came across it. After I learned about Jane's story, I knew I wanted to write a book, or she seemed like she'd be an interesting character in a book. But I didn't really want to write a book with her as the main character. For one, because I didn't want to highlight her thoughts on things, I guess. And for two, I didn't want to spend 3 years inside her head that it would take if she was the main character. So that's where, I guess, more of the imagination came into the book, where the main character is completely fictional, but a younger reporter who becomes friends with Jane in a personal way, but who also grew up Mennonite and, is, I guess, thoroughly democratic, so doesn't, disagrees with Jane's politics. But that's the conflict of how does this character deal with having a friend like Jane? Yeah.
Maybe this would be a good moment, Ted, for you to
Sure.
read that little bit from the prologue where we get introduced to Jane for the first time.
Yeah. So, yeah, it kind of like present, and I'll read a little bit from introducing Martha Hess, who's like the fictional character here too, but just introducing the characters. But a lot of the stuff from Jane is all true from her history, and then it kind of makes the switch into the fictional midway. Jane Anderson was born in Atlanta in 1880. This may be when she met the other woman, though Jane always claimed to be younger than she was, 36 at the most. Her mother came from a good family. Lucky Street in Atlanta is named for her grandfather, Foster, though she took on Jane as an alias when she attended Piedmont College, and by the end of her life, she responded only if addressed as Doña Juana. Her childhood was split between Georgia and Arizona, where her father was a lawman and a confidant of the showman Buffalo Bill Cody. Jane knew him as Uncle Buffalo. She was 5'9" with deep-set green eyes and tawny red hair she wore long, curled at the bottom. She was partial to she hats, dangling peacock feathers, pert silk bows, long jackets with epaulettes on the shoulders. At one point, she laid claim to being the most beautiful woman in the world. In those days, she seduced Joseph Conrad, a national hero in Britain, and made a ludicrous bid to usurp his fortune. Her only defect, it was said, was her nose. Her nose was broad, the nostrils too prominent, and it made her look common to those who knew what a nose should look like. A phrenologist claimed, because of the shape of her nose, that she was prone to sociopathy, that she was a born liar, that it would be a crime if she ever reproduced. She never did. Jane reported for the Daily Mail from both Allied and German trenches during the First War as the personal protege of publisher Lord Northcliffe. She began carrying a Red Cross uniform to pose as a nurse, to sneak in where journalists weren't supposed to go, then kept up the habit her entire life. After the war, she was an alcoholic, a failed actress. Her star fell. It became known that her life was a complete mess, as she wrote about her exploits in the news and in 3 novels. She stalked H.G. Wells. She hatched a scheme to assassinate Lenin. She accepted marriage proposals from at least 24 men, but was married only twice, once to a famous composer and once to a Spanish count who finagled a royal wedding at the Gothic Cathedral in Seville as a bridal gift. Despite the honest commissions she made as a correspondent and that she was typically surrounded by rich men, she was almost always broke. She spent her whole life chasing money, as people do when they grow up teased with affluence that isn't really theirs. Jane Anderson was one of the most baffling, provocative women of her generation, and she knew it. Most people struggle to resist her field of gravity. And I think I will stop there. Jane.
So, Ted, all of that part is pretty much straight from research.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you were drawn in by her field of gravity, but your protagonist, as you said, is very unlike her politically. And actually, Isabel and Martha seem to both have a little bit of a similar background. They're both young women of the plains and have been shaped by that environment. And so, Elizabeth, I thought this would be a way we could get back to talking about Isabel and looking at that passage about place that you write so lovingly about, and talk a little bit about the significance of place in shaping Isabel as a character, which seems to connect a little bit back to your own experiences.
Isabel Graham lives in Popland. She lives at 300 Greenwood Street, which is where my grandfather Mills, the one that studied in Vienna, lived. My grandfather Mills' friend, the son of Dr. Prairie. Dr. Prairie was his friend, is right here. Anyway, there's so much of the people in this book. And Isabel did study German in Vienna and learned. She had a real gift for German. And then she studied with the tutors, and she went to Wellesley and majored in German, so she really knows German well. And it's important in the story that this happened. But she developed as a person a lot, as in the Prairie with that cousin for a while, and with her sister and everybody else. And here's about place. This is Isabel. One second. Here it is. This is Isabel. Isabel has now, the night before, met, and I probably will read from that too later. For the first time, she met the Santa Fe train that came in August 1943 with the first prisoners. And it was a train, a hospital train full of POWs who had been injured. And these POWs that were injured would eventually go to camps, but they went first to the hospital in my book, which is closer to the Flint Hills. And she has met them. They have, some of them are terribly injured and will be treated at the hospital. And she has convinced her editor, she's been working for a newspaper just in the year after graduating from Wellesley, and she's convinced him she's the only German-speaking person on the newspaper staff. She majored in it at Wellesley, wrote her thesis on Stefan's body. And she's convinced him that she should go to the hospital and see if she can interview them. And so she's going on her horse because she had a horse that was kept at a pig farm just outside of town. And I wanted to know that my sister kept her horse and my cousins and my good friend Sarah Davis at the same pig farm. So that's all based in reality. Joe came running. She's at the farm and getting Joe. He was 13 now, sleek and strong, with a reddish coat that glistened in the sun. Isabel led him back to the barn for saddling, mounted, and rode north toward town, and then west on a dirt road that took him across a limestone bridge over a creek coming out of the Flint Hills. On the bridge, Joe balked. He had never liked bridges. Isabel gently coaxed him to take the first step, and after that, he kept going, breaking into an unbidden trot when his hoofs hit dirt on the other side. Isabel guided him onto an old buffalo path that led into the hills. The familiar climb pleased him. He strained at the bit, and Isabel let him go at his own fast pace. The prairie hummed in the warmth of the August sun. A buck and doe watched her from a grove of trees called red cedar in Kansas, but which Diane, Isabel's cousin, had discovered were Juniperus virginiana, a member of the juniper genus. A flock of orioles flew overhead. In a little less than 2 hours, they reached the hill called Buffalo Ridge, where the Army had built a general hospital for injured and ill American soldiers and POWs. Joe stopped at the barbed wire fence that surrounded the grounds, and Isabel looked across 150 acres flattened by bulldozers and mostly stripped of wild grasses and flowers. Before her was a cantonment-style hospital with 56 single-storage wards, each with a red brick veneer set in long rows about 15 feet apart. She had read in the newspaper that besides the wards there were 2 adjoining surgery buildings, 4 mess halls, a laundry, gymnasium, movie theater, post office, and gas station. Across the ground she saw military police standing watch in a guardhouse at a wide gate. Isabel began to circle the hospital from behind the wire fence. According to the newspaper, the facilities at Buffalo Ridge would have covered about 80 square blocks in town, and she figured the Army had chosen this site on the prairie, at least partly to save money. And I won't read the rest of that passage now, but she circles the fence, meets the wrangler who's got horses that are being used for therapy purposes, and she stops, and she sees that 1-story building with the guy with the bandage. And, you know, there's the image from my whatever those imaginary moments are, and she sees him behind the barred window.
So, Elizabeth, are you calling on some of your own youthful recollections in
Yeah.
a way?
Yeah, I'm a Prairie file. Look at the cover of the book. Terry, the great Prairie photographer Terry Evans took this. This is her farm in Kansas. She lives in Chicago now, but she lived down the street from my sister Marcia, and we're very close. My sister Marcia lived in Salina, and she has died, but Terry and I became very close friends, and we did a project for the Chicago Museum of Natural History on Prairie in the Dakotas. It was about fracking and the effect on Prairie. But yes, so the book is very much about, it's a combination. I think of it, you know, Wendell Berry talks about imagination as the thing that sort of unites past and present. And I feel that the book is that I'm living in the past, even though I was not, this is 43, I was born in 43. So I didn't live World War II. My dad did, he was in the Navy, my uncles were in the Army, they saw combat, my dad didn't. So I believe somehow that I've united, I'm not reliving the past, but it's all part of me, and whatever's good in the book is because some of it actually happened to me. And certainly riding horseback on Prairie happened to me.
Thank you. I think we could segue now to talk a little bit more in depth about the intersection of historical research and writing fiction. So I know, Elizabeth, you said earlier in an interview that you accessed the archives of the Kansas Historical Society to find out about German POW camps in Kansas.
Yes.
Can you want to talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
by the way, we're all three historians or history buffs. I have a master's degree in history. It's amazing how much Ted and I have found that we have in common. And I've read a wonderful essay by Sonia that's in the current issue of the Kansas Historical Society magazine. I highly recommend it. I was at the Kansas Historical Society. This is the kind of thing they had. Somebody had taken all the articles about the hospital, the Winter General, the Army Hospital in Topeka, and made a scrapbook of all these Capital and Journal articles about it. And I had just endless resources to learn about what it was to be in an Army hospital in those days. And the volunteers whose names I recognized had made the room where everybody played games and where they could rest and relax and where there were books, and had brought the carpet in. I could imagine one of my mothers or Melissa Porter's mothers doing that. I saw names of people I knew in that. And then this wonderful person at the historical center came with it was total evidence kept, and they had it, and I don't know how, because it was every month how many people, how many prisoners of war were in all the camps in Kansas, and how many patients were at the Army Hospital in Topeka, so that I knew it would have, the Army Hospital would have 100 patients and then it'd have 5, and I knew every month how many they had. So the evidence was really there, and there were articles not about the prisoners. Isabel never gets to interview the prisoners. She gets to know them because she's interpreting for them, but not as a journalist. She's an interpreter, and she becomes a nurse's aide and gets to know the patients too. And I read about the kinds of injuries the patients had, and it was just fabulous, really. So, and the history is what makes it credible. I don't think you can really be credible if you go against the history unless you're writing fantasy.
Ted, could you talk a little bit about what that process was like for you, and moving back and forth, or did you do your research first and then put it aside and write, or what was that like?
Mostly I did it advantage because this is my second historical novel, so I'd gone through the process of doing one with my first novel, Kings of Broken Things. That book took me 7.5 years to write, and I went through 3 complete drafts of it because I was learning like how to do it basically a few different times. with that book, I did a ton of research first. Like, I learned about German immigration. It's like, well, I need to know about German history if I'm going to understand German immigration. And went down all these long rabbit holes, which I think I did need to know that stuff eventually. But with this book, I think I gave myself a little more space to just write the story first, and then if there were gaps where I needed to know the history, then I would go back later and fill that in and kind of see how that moved the story, if it did or not. With this book, it was an added advantage too, because I was writing about journalists. So most all of them wrote memoirs. They kept diaries that were published later. So like it was easy to find that kind of stuff. Where my first book, I was writing about working class immigrant communities in Omaha in 1917. Like those people did not write books about their experience. Like people didn't really care about them that much to save any thoughts they had on their lives. So this was a lot easier to get into. I think too, hearing Elizabeth read like just how important it is to stand in the space too, which maybe some of the like journalistic background too. If you're reporting on a story, if you want to understand someone's life, you should see where they live, what conditions they live in, or like where they go to work and stuff like that to really understand character. So I try to bring that to fiction as well. Even historical fiction, so like going to Paris and finding a neighborhood where my characters would live, so I could understand like what trains they would have to take to get to work, or going to the hotels where they had press conferences and kind of sneaking around. Because usually they were too expensive for me to actually stay in, but I could sneak around a little bit and not cause any trouble. So that kind of research too, which is not historically necessarily, I think is really important for writing fiction. Just to understand it, and maybe coming from the plains too, like light is always really important to me too, and just seeing that kind of difference. Like when people ask me like, why should I visit Nebraska or why is Nebraska different, I always tell them the light is the thing I like the best in Nebraska. And I'm not a painter or like an artisan and kind of creative like that, but it's just very striking. So like when I go to a place, like I want to know that, is it kind of dreary and dark? Or like how the architecture is built. Like Berlin is pretty wide open. It's supposed to be like the Champs-Élysées in Paris, but it's very bright there too, and it's a northern city, right? So just walking around can help a lot with that kind of research. Or if is it hilly or flat, like stuff like that. Like will my character's feet hurt at the end of the day or not? Those are all important things.
Oh yeah, you don't want somebody to come up and say, why did you say that? Nobody would be able to walk all day and not have their feet hurt.
Yeah.
Really, that's the way you think. This is the other, look at what we have in common. This is so odd. My book is called Last Light. And I'm asked all the time, why Last Light? Well, the prairie light, it's everywhere in the prairie. And the girls get up early in the morning, Isabel and her cousin, to see first light because they think it's actually holy. I mean, as in holy, H-O-L-Y, because that's why they think the birds sing, because first light is holy and the birds are welcoming it. We would welcome some religious experience, and so that's why the book's called First Light and the book ends with Last Light. But this is the other thing that if you live on Prairie, you know that.
Elizabeth, you're coming from the opposite end of the spectrum, career-wise, starting in journalism and not starting in fiction. Was it hard to move back and forth between fact and fiction?
Yes, and we are both journalists, and I think that's pretty evident. But the fact that you are first and foremost a novelist is why this book is, and I'm not being modest here, why it's a better book than mine. It is. It's a very well-known novel, very well-done novel. And I like my book, and I think it's a good book, but it's not a great novel. And that's because I'm a journalist.
It is.
It has, you'll know anybody who's you would probably, if you were on a say, you can tell this is the work of somebody who's a journalist and not a deep, experienced novelist. My memoir is not a novel. It's pretty much journalism too in a way, although it has some fiction. But yeah, I think it's hard for a journalist. I'm trained to be as specific and use as few words as I can. And my best high English teachers would make us, and some of our assignments, take the assignment and cut it completely in half. and you just don't want to think quite that way when you're writing a novel. So, yeah, I think it's a little hard to go from being and I know many journalists have been very good novelists, and I'm glad that you got to do both and that you emphasized your novel writing, I think.
Yeah. When I went to college, I actually started in journalism, but I didn't like the fact my first professor said, "You're a really good writer, but we can turn you into a good journalist and teach you how to write." I said, "Well, I don't want to do that. I want to do something different, or I want to do what I want to do, basically, kind of thing." So I switched to English and creative writing, but it was kind of that joke that the first job I got out of college was as a journalist, and then I did that for 14 years. So I probably should have listened a little more than I did, but I think it is hard to switch. In some ways, my journalism was very low key, and there weren't a lot of eyeballs on it. But I could play around with language in different ways and not get yelled at by my editor that much, just because it wasn't on PBS and everything.
Well, I remember Jim Lehrer, my boss at PBS, he wrote something like 40 novels.
Really?
And if you read them, you'll know that she was a journalist. They're good. They're really good, but you'll know.
So, I want to kind of set of questions also concerns kind of what I think of as a similar kind of moral core in the way you approach World War II, both of the books. So Ted, as you said before, understandably you didn't want to spend 3 months inside the head of a fascist, and you have this wonderful other character who I understand is fictional, and she is also subject to almost supernatural kind of visions. It's really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about her character, what drew you into talking about the story of Jane Anderson, but through the moral framework of this particular young woman?
Yeah. So, really, so I found Jane Anderson in 2014, and I didn't really start writing this book until 2020. But I think a lot of that was trying to find that counterbalance to the main character who could be implicated in Jane's character in some way, but also want to work against her. So it was actually driving back from Sioux City, where I just covered an Elizabeth Warren event in 2019 when she was running for president. But it occurred to me that this character should have been raised Mennonite. Mostly because I wanted a character who had pacifism at their core, or was raised with that as a core value. And if this character was raised Mennonite, then she would have that. I later learned in my research that World War II was a huge inflection point for Mennonite communities, where people had to decide whether they wanted to stay, kind of away from the rest of the world, or if they should join the war effort, right, and fight against this, or this kind of moral conundrum. So it's kind of the moment when most people left old order, Mennonite, kind of way they think of Amish. Mennonite's a very broad term, of course. So once that occurred to me, I could really get into this character and think about what it would mean to her, and having her come from an assembly that did shunning too, so she could never come home again. That she kind of held onto this homesickness for the Prairie. It was also nice for me too, because my first 3 books were largely set in Nebraska. So writing a book that's completely set in Paris made me really nervous that I would be outed, I guess, or be obvious how unsophisticated I am and uncosmopolitan. But it made me feel better if my main character was even worse than I was, then I could write this book. But it really fit, I think, going through it. The main hook is that Miel, or Martha, has this vision that she is meant to kill Jane by the end of the book, and then through a series of coincidences, obviously, she has opportunity to do that. But I always came back to the old Flannery O'Connor quote, which is, the plot is what you do to your character. So her being Mennonite, believing in pacifism, but she's in the middle of this, biggest outburst of violence in history. She has this vision where she is meant to kind of participate in that. And what would she do? I wrote this book like, chronologically or through the book, so like I didn't let myself answer that question until I got to the very end of the book and it happened, which helped a lot too, but I think it also allowed the character to stay in that sense of moral uncertainty for as long as possible too, where I wasn't imposing something on her and just let it play out on the page as much as possible.
Again, the more similarities kind of come out between these characters.
Yeah, we can't say what's so similar in my book without giving too much away. You can't, it gives it away, which is what you said didn't give away anything in your book. But there's a similar question about killing in the book, so it's really odd that this happened. I think we may be related. I think we should look at our back. Yeah, our history.
So I have one more question, kind of picking up a little bit on the similar theme. You said that your generation, grew up hearing all about World War II, and there were people in your family who were in service, and you thought a lot about Germany and how Germany could let this happen. Is this book a way of you kind of interrogating that, or trying to kind of answer that question?
Well, I would bet there's nobody in this room over the age of 60 who hasn't at some point been obsessed with the question of how could it have happened, World War II? How could they have killed millions of Jews and Roma people and Gypsies? I mean, how could this have happened? And to say nothing of how could we have bombed into oblivion Dresden and all these beautiful places. And I've been to those places. I've been to Dresden actually, but I've certainly spent time in Berlin and I've spent time in Vienna, and I've been to other of those places. And yes, I don't think you can be a thinking person and not wonder. I don't know why the things that are happening right now are happening in Lebanon and everywhere else. And yes, I'm somewhat obsessed with that, and it's probably why I became a foreign correspondent who went to places where those things were happening. We don't know why, do we really? Why some of us are so obsessed with those things. Do you want me to read a little bit just about?
Yeah, sure.
Well, but we may not have time for more readings though, right?
Well, we have a little bit of time. I think
Well,
that would be nice.
well, this is just to give a sense of what it would be like to be an interpreter for somebody who's wounded. Actually, I think it's probably too long to read. I'm not going to read it right now. But the book is because she's helping both American soldiers who are injured, and she's interpreting for a soldier who's so injured that he's lost his memory, can't use his arm. When the Allies won in Tunisia, many of you probably know this, it was an enormous victory, but they got so many thousand POWs that they had nowhere to put them. And the generals that were in charge were appalled at what happened, because many of those prisoners died from diphtheria and the kinds of things. They were basically in caged camps, and it was terrible. So the first prisoners that came to America, the prisoners had mostly been going from the war to England. There were so many, the English couldn't take them all. The English got the cream of the crop. They got the people that were probably the most important for spying and for getting information. But everybody else came here. Thousands, 40,000 POWs came to America. And so these people that she's dealing with are terribly injured. Many of the people who died before they got here. But they're terribly injured, and her person is terribly injured. And she doesn't know him well enough to like him or dislike him, because he has terrible amnesia. But on the other hand, he is different from the other prisoners. He's really different. He knows music. There's a musician who's been injured and who plays for everybody in the hospital. And the music goes all through the book, and he recognizes all the pieces and knows them, especially the German composer's pieces. And he treats people better than some of the prisoners. There's two people who are clearly Nazis, openly Nazis. He doesn't act like that. So she thinks maybe he's not, and he says he is, but is that true? And she doesn't want to be a spy. you know, her head of the hospital says, do you think he is who he says he is? If he's not who he says he is, that usually means they want to make some kind of a deal for him. It can mean they want to make some kind of a deal for information. So all those things are coming out of this. But yeah, I think obsession, I think we wouldn't be human if we didn't want to try to answer questions about why these terrible things happen.
Well, as a teacher, you know, I think a lot about how what I present to students will capture their imagination, because I'm not sure that we can understand history through this illusion of, you know, just objectivity, just facts, and without trying to use our imaginations a little bit.
That's a very interesting thing to say. I think that's true, but I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, we used to like, or what's the cliche that like the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of 10,000 people is a statistic.
Yeah.
And like, I think the value, a lot of journalism does this too, but the value of fiction is like putting the focus on that one person and understanding like these massive tragedies, like putting that in more real human terms. I was watching the interview you did with Jeffrey Brown with your last book when you were talking about fixers and that, which is I think really interesting because like the people when you're doing a story like that who know the area, like know who to talk to, can get you around, get a journalist around safely, but they're off camera all the time, and they're also often the people who face the most risk in a story too. But I thought that was so touching because it was that idea of like why does this matter? Like what is the human element of the story? You know, thinking about fixers was a brilliant way of doing that. I think of like that it does matter to that like that human.
Just so people know, the fixer's the person that we hire in the places that we work to translate for us in Iraq, for example, and also really to often they set up your appointments because they know you hire them because they're specialists in the place they are, and what Ted's referring to here is in Train Through Time, my memoir. It's a lot about a fixer because I stopped doing that dangerous work because of danger to the crews and to fixers. And a fixer that I worked with in Iraq was killed, he was working with the New York Times then. But, so the obsessions are probably more so for me than ever because of having lived with those things. I've lost several friends in those situations.
Well, I just want to thank you both for your work. My own grandfather was Heinrich Bender, and he was a medic and musician in the German army and was captured when Rommel fell in North Africa and ended up in a POW camp somewhere, but my family doesn't talk about it because there was a veil of silence.
I'll bet he was in the same prison camp as my character.
Let's just say I had a lot of personal moments reading this book. Yeah, but I think I'd have to, luckily I can read German, so now I want to go find the archives and
I bet he
try
was,
to
it's
figure
called
out.
Mateur, M-A-T-E-U-R, which is where they were. I'll bet you he was.
Well, yeah, so
Oh my
so much to find out.
I think the three of us are related.
I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. Anyone like to? Hi, Jeffrey. Hi there.
I have a process question for Elizabeth. Not only is your story very gripping and based on history, but it's elegantly written. And at what point did you unify artistically with some of the idioms for a lot of personalized classes? I've read your book, Jen, so I can't.
I want you to know that Jeffrey, I wouldn't have Thea as a publisher if Jeffrey and Tony had sent me to her, so thank you for that. And also, I said, I didn't think it was worth publishing. And I said, should I publish it on April? And Jeff said, yes. I also love poetry, I love music, and I can't explain why there's a lot of poetry in the book, and there's not a lot, but some poetry, and Billy Greenwood is the wrangler of the horses that are therapy horses, and by the way, Winter General didn't have therapy horses. This is definitely a fictional hospital. And he was an English major, and he recites poetry till winter over. So, as I say, he wooed her with with poetry a powerful aphrodisiac. And so there's a poetry in the book, and then there's also the music. And I don't know how, but I realized that one of the hospital has to be a place that feels like a real place that actually existed. And this wonderful quote, he was a private actually, who was a very unusually great musician and didn't want to be an officer and just be a musician in the army because he wanted to be with the guys that were seeing combat. And so he plays the piano almost every day in the first war, where that room that our mothers and grandmothers and aunts made was a nice place to put it in. And so that it has all that. But thank you for saying that. I'm glad you think it's literary.
Okay, so I like reading, watching, listening to stories that have lots of historical references in them, which is what we're talking about right now. But, and I'm going to say it's for both of you, but probably particularly Pet. If you're doing that much research on history, like not the protagonist, but the person you're talking about that was the actual fascist, when do you know to break away from the historical? Because I would think that you could get really marked down with all that research and all the things that are factual. When do you know to break away from that to go into the fictional part?
Yeah. Some of it is just like finding a character who has a lot of gaps in the history. So if you're writing about someone who's really famous and everything is known about them, it's easy to just stay in the history. But like Jane had more gaps, like what she was doing before she moved to Germany and stuff like that. So it left me more space where I could just write fiction because I had to fill in the gaps. And maybe I strategized to stay in those gaps longer. Some of it's just feeling like when do you need something, trying to anticipate who your reader is going to be. So like, will they know all these references, or even if people don't know the references, can they still enjoy the story? Like kind of balance those things. It's just like intuition. One thing I hit on with this book was that I use history as a frame more than anything. So like it starts the weekend after the Munich Agreement is signed, which is like when the Allies gave Czechoslovakia away to Hitler. So like that's where it starts. Like at the end of like the midpoint of the big instigation during Kristallnacht. So like I kind of assume that most people at least have heard these things and have a general idea. But I also use real reporting, so I have a few excerpts where I got permission to use writing by William Shire and Edward Murrow and Dorothy Thompson. So I just put their actual reporting in the book and let that be like the history lesson. So then when I was writing fiction, I never, I didn't really, well, not that I never, but I wouldn't try to stop myself from doing that. Or if I was, it's like, it's not a history book, this is not a lecture, and I would just cut it out and just let the story stand on its own within that. So, I don't know, probably the two biggest things are just like looking for those gaps and like what kind of readers do you want? Like, are they the kind of reader who wants a ton of history, or are you just going for like a general reader who will maybe will be interested in the history but is more interested in the character? So like, write towards who you think is going to read the book and enjoy it.
That's a good lesson for writers. That's really interesting.
This is a question also for Ted, and it's kind of a question of have you read another reading the story maybe that goes on Mennonite. But the more general issue there, it's really interesting to think of the Mennonite background for your characters. They are so conflicted in this war. They are a peace church, but they are also mostly German. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I was not raised Mennonite. I didn't really know anything about it. I guess I had two friends in high school who were Mennonite, but we didn't know that was anything different than, I guess, mainstream Protestants, except they didn't register for the draft, right? They objected on religious grounds. So I think that kind of stuck in my head. But it was just more that idea, I think, thinking about the peace and this idea of being cloistered, which is a theme that runs through a lot of my work, just thinking about are we complicit in things that our government does? Like, are we complicit in war, even if like we're against it and we protest against it in these kind of ways? So it seemed to track, I guess, in things that I was interested in. And then as I did more research, specifically around Kelowna, Iowa, which is where the character's from, like it seemed to track really well. And maybe sometimes like when you just kind of make a choice and you push in that direction, sometimes the history supports it and you're like, oh, like, you know, I'm going to sound smart here even though I'm probably, like, I didn't know what I was doing when I did it. And sometimes you have to adjust, but I think I got lucky on this one where it's just more like, I wanted her to come from Iowa, like I wanted her to be a pacifist, and then like, I got that history that came along with it. Even though like, the process told me that more so than just me knowing what I was talking about when I started.
And one other thing that we share in these books is that the Mennonite characters this is not giving anything away, has had a trauma, a very bad trauma as a child. And Isabel has also had a bad trauma as a child. And those traumas, we didn't mention them, but they're crucial in the book.
Yeah.
Ben's book, by the way, is interesting because it looks at pro-Nazi Mennonites, which sounds like a complete contradiction in terms, but they're out there. So, it's really good.
You'll get the title afterwards.
My question actually was about that trauma issue, because both in the memoir with the loss of your mother, under circumstances in which you weren't fully informed what was going on, there's a parallel with Elizabeth, with the loss of her tutor and not being fully informed what was going on. To what extent is that a motivating factor to you in writing these stories?
Did everybody hear the question? How much did the loss of my mother at age 9, and she got sick when I was 6, so I really kind of lost her then. She had cancer. A motivating factor, and probably all of us, probably in this room there are 5 other people who lost parents young. It's the motivating factor for much of what you do in your life. It's just universal, that fact. And even when I don't know what's happening, I have the same kind of vision at Skywalker Ranch where I did the audio for the film, The Judge and the General. And I was out, it was a very hard edit session with one sentence over and over and over to get I think there must have been background noise or something, and the audio engineer was trying to get the background noise out. It was a terrible sentence about, they just discovered the remains of somebody that was killed under Pinochet in Chile. The film is about that period, and I lost friends in Chile to Pinochet's forces too. So I went outside to where George Lucas has got all these fabulous things from films, and he's got TikTok from one of the TikTok more recent Wizard of Oz films. And basically TikTok said to me, why are you doing this? You know, you don't have to do this. Why are you doing this? And that's what made me write the novella, to try to figure out whether there was some tie between my own childhood. They didn't know to tell me that my mother had died, so I thought I could find her. I thought maybe she just disappeared. They said, my dad said she's gone. And so...
But that's the same thing that happens to Elizabeth.
Yeah, it is. It is. We can't say much about that. She doesn't know why her tutor just disappeared in Vienna one day. The disappeared are, if you have friends who have disappeared and been disappeared, I know somebody that was dumped from the helicopter into the sea by Pinochet's forces. And once you have that, it does stick with you.
Well, let's see, I think actually it's just time to wrap up so we can all go to our next session. I thank our panelists so much.
Thank you.